make your game in GameMaker interactive, you need to use objects. These will use sprites typically, but they don't have to, and it's where all the code for your game will live. Well, at least a large majority of your code. This is what makes your game interactive. And to create a new object, I'm going to right-click and use Create. There are also other ways to do it. By going to your resources up here, you can click on Create Object, which is Alt-O. Once you do, you get a window over here and your events list as well. It also appears right here in your resource tree. The first thing you probably want to do is give it a name, and you want to start off with some sort of identifier. In this case, I'm going to use obj, then I'm going to use an underscore, and we'll just call this test. You can call it whatever you like. You can also just use test. You can call it whatever you want, as long as you have some sort of identifier at the beginning, just so you can sort through it easier. And for that, I'm going to use obj and call it test. The next panel down is asking for a sprite. Now, you don't actually have to use a sprite for the objects in your game, but typically you will use a sprite. And for this, we can click right here and select one of the sprites from our game. Now, I only have one sprite, which is this Mega Man one. I can select no sprite or Mega Man. If I didn't have a sprite yet that I wanted to use, set it back to none, I can click here and create a new sprite. If I do that, it's just like before, where it starts a file for a new sprite, and I can edit it, create it, whatever I want to do, and it automatically assigns it to this object. But instead, I'm going to use this Mega Man one. Also, you can edit the sprite, or you can edit the image by opening the image editor. You can also see the size of the sprite right here, 62 by 48. Now, of course, when editing sprites, you're allowed to create a collision mask for your sprite, but you don't have to use that collision mask for the object. Down here under collision mask, it says same as sprite. This will use the collision mask for this sprite. If you want to remember what this looks like, it'll be the collision mask down here. We can preview the mask right here. It's just this horrible circle. I didn't actually set it up for Mega Man. But this will be the mask that is used, unless I'd like to use something else, in which case I can click here and select a different sprite, and this object will use the collision mask from that sprite. This might be necessary for your game. But in this case, I'm going to use same as sprite. And if you want, you can also edit the mask for your sprite. Below that are 4 checkboxes. We've got visible. If you turn this off, it doesn't matter if you have a sprite or not, your sprite will not exist. It won't show up in your game, but the object will still run all of its code. But it won't run the draw event, and we'll get into that when we talk about events. But since I've selected a sprite, I might as well have it visible. I can also use this tag called solid. I can say whether or not this object is solid, which is really just a identifier for GameMaker itself that you can use and call upon to check, is this a solid object, is it not a solid object. It's best if you have a solid object not to have it move. It's something like a wall, and it's just so you can check like collisions or whatever you want to do. You can say, hey, is this thing solid? Yes, then don't move it. Or if it's solid, okay, don't run into it. But it's just a handy little toggle if you want. Most of the time you don't even need it. Below that we've got persistent. This means that as your game changes from room to room or level to level, this particular object will continue to exist in each room, constantly running its code. Might not be needed for most things in your game, but it could be important for controller objects. This would be an object typically doesn't have a sprite for it, and it runs code that's throughout your entire game. It can store things like your score or your lives or something that's not tied to the player, or just a lot of background code. So it wouldn't have an image, and it would be persistent from room to room. But for that, we're going to turn it off because we're going to create the character instance of this object each time we go to a new level. And if you want to use a physics engine, this uses Box2D, we can toggle use physics. This will allow us to use physics functions, and we can click this box down here to set all of the different variables for using physics, but that will be in a different video, so we're not going to use it. Another option is parenting. This allows you to make this object the child of another object, and it will inherit all the code. Why inheritance is important is you can make one object run a bunch of code, and then a bunch of different objects all inherit that code and run it as well without writing it multiple times. This could be important if, say, you created an object that was just called enemy, and this ran all of the code for just being a static enemy, just a regular enemy, how bullets collide with it, or what happens if the player collides with it, something like that. And then all your different enemies in the game can be children of this one object. And then, if you need to check for collisions or whatever, you just check for that one parent. And then there you go. Everything else will follow suit. So this is really nice, but we'll get into parents in another video. The last thing to talk about is the meat of what's in this window, and that is events. Now the event window is already open, but I could collapse it and open it back up if I wanted to. You can think of events as triggers or reactions to something in the game. Two ways to add events is to either right-click an empty spot here, and you get this nice drop-down menu. You can click Add Event, or you can just click the Add Event button. Either way, you'll get the same drop-down list of various events that can take place. So what will happen is this is some sort of trigger in the game. This is when the instance of your object is created, when it's destroyed, when something ends in your game, either the character, this instance of this object ends, the game ends, the room ends, whatever. It's a way to trigger a cleanup section where you can clear out your memory buffer, something more complicated we'll get into later. You have step events, which is code that is constantly being looped through and happening every cycle of the game, typically 30 or 60 cycles per second, something like that. Alarms that'll go off. We'll go through each one individually, but the point is something will be triggered, like a key being pressed, and then you write your code. What happens when I press that key? So let's just get into these events. Now the first event is the create event. If I click it, I'll get a code window. This will happen for each event you add. This is where you can start writing in your code. You can create variables, make them equal things, whatever. And the create event will only trigger once, and that's when an instance of the object is created. Now I'm going to define the difference between object and instance. An object is like a blueprint for an instance. It's something that lives over here in your resource tree, and when you have a room or level in your game, you're actually adding like a copy of this blueprint into the game. So you can spawn many enemies or players or whatever is happening in your game. You can think of it that way too, like a spawner. So this is like the box that holds all the information, and whenever you want one of these enemies or characters, whatever instance of an object to appear in your game, all of this code will then go on top of that instance. It'll do whatever it wants to do. You need to know the difference between the two, because if you change any of the code inside an object, all instances that get spawned from that object later will adopt that code. But if you change the code to just one instance of that object, so you have, like in Mario, 4 Goombas on the screen, and you just change the code to one of those Goombas, that's an instance of the Goomba object, only that Goomba will get the changes to that code. So just think of it that way. An object is like a blueprint, and when you do create one of these instances, this event will trigger. And this is typically where you would put something, a bunch of variables for this object, something that's only going to look at once, like setting the health to your player, setting whatever, and then that's it. And then you're done. And you don't have to look at it again. But if you want something to happen all the time, like checking to see if a key is being pressed to move your character, well, we're going to need a different event. But we'll get into that. Now I don't want this event anymore, so I can either use cut, copy, paste, duplicate. In this case, at the bottom, I've got delete event. You can also change it to a different event if you'd like, and you get your drop down again. Or you can convert it to drag and drop. We're not covering drag and drop in these videos, but it is a cool thing you can do, switching between GML and drag and drop. But I'm going to switch it back to GML and say OK, and just delete this event. The next event is the destroy event. This is when you actually call for a function that destroys the instance of this object, then all of this stuff will trigger. So if your character dies, like an enemy or whatever, maybe particles explode or score increases or something. So it's a good way to say, okay, it got destroyed, do some destruction stuff, and move on. The next event, as I mentioned, was cleanup. Now, this triggers whenever the instance is destroyed, the room ends and you go to a new room, or the game ends. And the reason for this interesting event is so you can clean up anything you've buffered into memory. Some things in GameMaker you have to occupy a space in memory, like reserve a space, and put stuff in there. Like particles will do that, data structures will do that, and it'll sit in memory until you remove it from memory. And the best time to remove it from memory is when it's not being used anymore, typically when the instance is no longer there, or you're in a different room where the game has been closed, in which case you can throw that into the cleanup event. The next event is the step event. Now we've got three here, but they all do the same thing. A step event is code that will be looped through while the game is running, every step of the game, every cycle of your CPU or whatever you're measuring it by. In which case, this will be steps for GameMaker, and this is defined by your game speed, which is something like 30 or 60. This is important because this is how your game will function. This is if you press right on the arrow keys, your character will move to the right. That has to be checked every single cycle to make sure that you're constantly moving to the right. And this is split into three things, which is just step, begin step, and end step. Now, they're all part of the same step event, but if you need something to happen before something else, you might need to put it in the begin step. And if you need something to happen later, it might be the end step. This is just a way for you to separate your step event into three different sections, because you might need something to happen and then another thing to happen, but it has to happen after, in which case you can throw that in the end event or something like that. Usually, like if there's a collision and then you need to update animation later, or a good one is if something is following your mouse, you want the mouse to move, and then you need the update to happen later in the end step so that it looks like it's following it one to one. We'll get into that later. But all you have to know is your step event is where a bulk of your code is going to go, because this is where your game loop is. This is where all the code is going to run all the time. Below that, we've got alarms, which is what it sounds like. You will set an alarm at some sort of game speed, and then when it hits 0, the event will trigger, and then whatever code is inside here will be executed. So you would set up an alarm. A great way to explain it would be something like in the create event, you can tell your alarm to start at, let's say, 60 steps. So that's 2 seconds if your game is running at 30 steps per second. And then when that elapses, the alarm will go off and it'll trigger whatever code is in here. So this is a great way to set things in a rhythm in games, do it later, make something random. You can do random times, whatever you need to do. And you get little tabs here when you have multiple ones, events in your event tree here. After the alarms, we have the draw event. This is where everything gets drawn. This is all your code for drawing. And if you turn off visible, GameMaker will just skip the draw events completely. So nothing will be drawn, and anything you've written in here will also be skipped over. So you kind of want to make sure that you don't make it invisible if you want to write things in your draw events. Now, you can draw things to the view of the game, or you can draw things to the GUI, or the graphic user interface. This is mapped more to the actual window of the game. So let's say you were turning and scaling the view, anything drawn to the GUI would stay put. Think of it like a heads-up display in a first-person shooter or anything like that. Fighting game even has health bars at the top, and they don't move with the camera, they stay fixed to the actual window of the game. This is also segmented into begin and end steps, just like the step event, just in case you need something to happen before another thing. Then you get into more complicated stuff like pre-draw and post-draw and window resize, which are not something we need to go into right now, but they're used to draw something to the full screen render, so not to views necessarily, or not to the GUI, which is the actual window on the screen. And the window resize will trigger if the window to your game has been resized for some reason, like when Windows snaps it to the left or right, or someone's manually resizing. This will trigger, and this might be a good opportunity to change some sort of aspect of how your game looks, because you didn't want someone to resize your window in a certain way, or whatever's necessary for your game. But if you're just starting off, Just the draw event alone is something that's very powerful, but also resource heavy. So try not to put a lot of code that's not necessary to drawing in here because it does take up a lot of processing power. The next few events deal with some of the most important stuff you're going to do with your first game, which is mouse events and keyboard events. Now, with mouse event, we have whenever you are holding down the left, right, or middle mouse button, whether or not you're not pressing anything at all, if you just there's no mouse input, whether you've just pressed down the left, right, or middle, or just released the left, right, or middle. Also, whether or not the mouse has entered or left the object in question, whatever object this is tied to, in which case this is going to be tied to one of the instances of this Mega Man object, or whether we use mouse wheel up or mouse wheel down. Now we also have this one called global, and the reason for that is each one of these events is assuming that the mouse cursor is colliding with this particular instance's collision box. If you want this stuff to trigger and you don't need the mouse to be colliding with anything, if it's just like a control object somewhere in the background, so if you click anywhere, it will trigger. That's what you use global for. You'll notice global doesn't have enter and leave because it doesn't require a collision box at all. So this is holding down left, right, or middle anywhere in the game, just pressing it or just releasing it. And the same thing can be done with the keyboard buttons, whether or not you're holding it down each step, whether you just pressed it since last step, or whether you just released it since last step. And inside each one, they're identical. We have the arrow keys, left, right, up, and down. We have some of the modification keys like Control, Alt, Shift, Space, and Enter. We have the keypad, which is the numpad on the right side, which is all your calculator functions, numbers, and multiplication, division, plus all the operators. We have your digits, which is the top row of number keys. We have your letters, which is the middle section of the keyboard, obviously. Your function keys along the top, and some other keys like backspace, escape, home, and page up, down, delete, and insert. We also have no key being pressed, just like when we had mouse, no button being pressed. And we have if any key is pressed. You probably have seen this at the starting of older games, maybe, where it just says press any key to start. Doesn't matter. It'll read any input from your keyboard, and then your game will begin, or whatever you need it to do when someone presses any key. Beyond that, we have gestures. These are typically used for mobile devices or any kind of touch device. And we have taps, double taps, the starting of a drag while you are dragging something, when the drag ends, or flick. That's the kind of like velocity driven one where you grab something and flick it away and there it goes. This also takes a collision box, but you can also do a global one. So this will be anywhere on the screen. There are also collision events, and this is whether or not you're colliding with a particular instance of an object somewhere in the game. Now, I only have one object right now, but if I just created a dummy object and checked back here for adding a collision event, I can now say, okay, what if I'm colliding with this other object? What will happen? And in this case, this could be the parent enemy I was talking about, or just any other enemy or a wall or whatever, and then I would write in here what would happen if I collided with that object. Should I die? Should I stop moving? What if I'm about to collide with it? So this is where collisions are handled. After collisions, we've got other. These are all kind of made up ones for GameMaker. They're very specific to GameMaker, like what happens if you have left the room, you're outside of the actual boundaries of the room. That could cause you to wrap around to the other side. It could cause you to die. It could cause something to happen. Or if you intersect the boundaries of the room. GameMaker in your rooms can use views, which is kind of like a camera, but there actually are cameras in GameMaker. So this is just a portion of your room being shown on screen at one time. Think about Mario scrolling through a level. Just the portion you're seeing at any one time is the view. And whether or not you're outside of one of these views or you're intersecting with the boundaries of one of these views, this could push the camera further. This could, like I said, it could kill your character. It could do whatever. We have what happens when the game actually starts up or the game ends. This could also be important for running a bunch of loading options or some sort of variables or something that gets your game started up. And we also have game end. This would have been a really good spot to clear out some memory buffers, but cleanup will also do that really well for you, unless you only need it to happen when the game ends. We also have room start and end, similar to game start and end, but it's when you enter a new room. What happens when the room starts up? What happens when you leave the room? This can clear things out of memory. This could trigger some other event. You can accumulate score, something. I mean, it really is up to you. It all is just something happens, some trigger, and then your code happens because of it. These animation events are animation end. This is when your sprite has reached the end of its sequence. If you remember, Mega Man has these 4 frames. So once we get to the end here, the 4th frame, then this event would trigger. And we also have animation update or animation event. These are specific to skeletal animations and are probably a little more complex for your first game, but I'll get into how skeletal animations can be brought into GameMaker instead of just simple pixel moving or even vector art. You can trigger something to happen when a path has ended, when your instance has finished following a path, and we'll get into paths later. Or you can even have a user-defined event. So this is just something that you say, event 0 is happening at this point. So call anything in event 0. And once again, you just get this code editor, and inside this block you would write whatever happens when event 0 is triggered. And it's up to you to decide what event 0 is and when it should be triggered. The last things are asynchronous events. This could be more complex than you would need for your first game, but this is something that is triggered outside of GameMaker, outside of the game that is running. For instance, your audio playback or recording, this could use some auxiliary audio device that is buffering a spot in memory for audio that's being recorded and what it's going to do when it plays it back. Cloud storage. We have things that call HTTP events, in-app purchases, network. So these are all things, even Steam is here, social events, and the system itself. These are all things that get triggered by something outside of your game when it's running, and then your game can do something because of that. Of course, this is just a quick overview of how the events work for instances of your objects. And each one of these I'll go into detail when I get into the functions that are built into GameMaker. But for now, I hope you understand which events are available for your objects. I hope you understand that instances are a copy of the object blueprint when the game is actually running. There'll be more on that when we get into rooms. And how to even create an object to begin with. Thank you.